What if I told you that some of the most powerful queens in history weren't just rulers of empires? They were also the masterminds behind some of the most horrific punishments ever devised. These women, often remembered for their regal beauty or political acumen, also wielded their power with a terrifying cruelty that history has chosen to forget. But today, we'll uncover the dark truth behind their reigns, revealing the brutality they imposed on those who dared to cross them. The queens we'll explore in this video aren't the kind of figures you read about in textbooks. They aren't the subjects of romanticized myths or painted portraits in royal palaces. No, these queens, long forgotten by history, used their power to create a legacy of fear, pain, and terror. They turned their thrones into instruments of punishment, devising punishments that were so ruthless, so horrifying, that they still send shivers down our spines to this day. Why are these queens forgotten? Why do their names and stories not echo in the halls of history like the famous kings and queens we all know? The truth is, the cruelty they perpetrated was so extreme, so grotesque, that it was often buried beneath layers of silence. But the past never truly disappears. The horrors they created, the fear they instilled, and the suffering they caused were too powerful to remain hidden forever. Let's take a moment to think about it. How far would you go to maintain control? To protect your throne? To punish those who defy you? The queens we'll meet today didn't hesitate. They used methods so brutal, so calculated, that they would make even the most infamous tyrants shudder. Have you ever wondered how power could corrupt someone so completely? Stay with me as we dive deep into the darkest corners of history and uncover the cruel punishments that were ordered by queens who have been forgotten by time. But before we begin, let me ask you, have you ever been faced with a choice so extreme you had to question your own morality? If so, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to stay updated on the most chilling stories from history. Trust me, what you're about to discover might surprise you. Now, let's go back in time to uncover the first queen whose name has been almost erased from the annals of history, but whose cruel punishments were felt by all who crossed her path. Imagine this. You're the ruler of a vast kingdom with absolute power in your hands, and yet, you look to the very people who should be your closest allies, your own family, and turn them into your greatest victims. This is the chilling reality for Queen, insert name, whose reign became infamous not for her battles or triumphs, but for the horrific punishment she inflicted on those she should have loved and protected the most, her own flesh and blood. This queen's cruelty toward her family wasn't driven by necessity or political strategy. It wasn't about securing her throne in the traditional sense. No, her actions were far more personal, far more deeply rooted in the darkness of her own mind. The power she held over her family members was more than a tool of control. It was a means of destruction. And what makes her story even more disturbing is that her family never stood a chance. They were mere pawns in her twisted game, left to suffer for offenses they never committed, often under the guise of royal duty or betrayal. One of the most chilling incidents occurred when she decided to imprison her own children, not for any political advantage, but as a punishment. Why? Because they dared to challenge her authority, or perhaps simply because she saw their very existence as a threat to her power. These children, who should have been nurtured and protected, were subjected to unimaginable torment. Her cruelty didn't stop there. In one particularly harrowing incident, she ordered the brutal execution of a family member who had once been her closest confidant. The act wasn't just about silencing a political opponent. It was an act of pure vengeance, an attempt to eliminate anyone who might challenge her reign, even if that person shared her blood. But what makes this story even more chilling is the fact that, insert queen's name, didn't just execute her family members in secret or behind closed doors. No, she made a spectacle of their punishment. She turned their deaths into public displays of power, acts designed to terrify everyone in the kingdom. Each execution was meticulously orchestrated to send a clear message. There was no mercy, not even for those closest to her. No one was safe. And as if that wasn't enough, she also forced her surviving relatives into positions of constant fear. Imagine being a child, or a spouse, or a sibling, living under the shadow of a queen who could decide your fate with the snap of her fingers. The psychological torture was just as intense as the physical punishments. Her reign became a living nightmare for her family, and while history has tried to erase her name from the record books, the terror she instilled in her loved ones still resonates today. How could a mother, a wife, a sister, someone who should have been a protector, become the very source of their greatest suffering? Imagine being a captive in a palace, knowing that at any moment your life could be turned upside down, not by sword or by war, but by the mind of a queen whose cruelty knows no bounds. This is exactly the fate of those who dared to cross queen, insert name, whose reign was not defined by military conquests or grand victories, but by a far more sinister and subtle form of punishment, psychological warfare. Queen, insert name, understood something that many rulers failed to grasp. Power didn't just lie in the ability to strike down your enemies physically. It lay in breaking them from within, making them question their own sanity, and bending them to, your will without lifting a finger. Her tactics were not just about fear, they were about control. She knew how to manipulate the minds of her enemies, making them doubt their reality, shatter their resolve, and ultimately surrender to her demands, without ever having to raise a blade. One of the most chilling tactics she employed was to trap her enemies in a web of confusion and uncertainty. She would have her captives placed in rooms with no windows, no clocks, and no way to measure the passage of time. For days, sometimes weeks, they would be left in complete isolation, with only the sounds of the palace echoing through the halls. The mind, as any psychologist knows, begins to unravel in such conditions. The isolation, the uncertainty, the fear of what might happen next. It all starts to wear down even the strongest of minds. But this queen didn't stop there. She would send her enemies cryptic messages, sometimes promising mercy, only to turn the tables at the last minute. Her victims would be led to believe they had been forgiven, only to be suddenly and cruelly betrayed. The constant flip-flopping between hope and despair became a form of torment in itself. It broke her enemies, turned them into mere shadows of who they once were. They were forced to live in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing what would come next. Then came the ultimate psychological punishment, the public display of power. Insert queen's name. Understood that the fear of suffering was often more intense than the suffering itself. So she orchestrated public humiliations, making sure her enemies knew they were being watched. She would have them paraded before her court, made to stand before the throne while the queen looked on with cold, calculating eyes. They were not just punished, they were forced to witness their own degradation. The worst part, many of her enemies were not killed outright. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, they were broken mentally, physically, and emotionally. Some were left to live in despair for years, their lives now nothing more than a shadow of what they had once been. Others were forced into roles they never would have imagined, doing menial tasks under the queen's watchful eye, reminding them every day of their defeat. But what makes insert queen's name even more terrifying is that her enemies, even in their broken state, still feared her. They feared her not just because of the power she held, but because they knew she could destroy them again, at any moment, with nothing more than a word or a glance. She was a queen who wielded fear as a weapon, not just to control, but to strip away the very humanity of those who crossed her. When it comes to power, Few things are as effective in asserting dominance as the brutal execution of those who dare to oppose you. But Queen, insert name, took this form of punishment to a level of unimaginable cruelty, turning public executions into a form of spectacle, not just for punishment, but as a means to send a clear and terrifying message to everyone in her realm. Betrayal would not be tolerated, and there would be no mercy. For, insert name, a public execution wasn't just about removing a threat. It was about creating fear, forcing everyone in her kingdom to witness the consequences of defying her. Her executions were meticulously planned, designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to degrade, and to make her enemies, and even her loyal subjects, understand that they were utterly powerless in her presence. One of the most disturbing examples of her cruelty came when she ordered the execution of a nobleman who had once been one of her closest allies. This man had once enjoyed the queen's favor, his family having served her for generations. But when he was accused of treason, the queen saw an opportunity to send a message. His execution wasn't carried out in private, or even behind palace walls. No, she demanded that it be done in the heart of the capital, in the public square where the common people could watch. But, insert name, didn't just have him executed. She wanted everyone to feel the weight of her judgment. She ordered the man to be tortured before his death, forcing him to beg for mercy in front of the entire city. The screams of the man echoed through the square as he was bound, stripped of his dignity, and subjected to hours of suffering. The public was made to watch, forced to feel the terror of what could happen if they, too, were ever in her position. The execution didn't end with the man's death. No, Queen, insert name, wanted to make sure her message would be remembered long after the event. She had his body displayed in the square for days, letting it serve as a gruesome reminder to all who walked past of what happened to those who betrayed her. The people, in a mixture of horror and awe, looked at the man's lifeless body, understanding that this was not just a punishment, it was a warning. But the cruelty didn't stop there. As the days passed, rumors spread that the queen had gone even further, not just punishing traitors, but finding new ways to torment those she deemed unworthy. Some say she used her public executions as a way to control the nobility, to force them into submission. Others claim she saw it as a way to reinforce her own power, reminding everyone that no one, not even the nobility, was safe from her wrath. It was in these moments that her true power was revealed. The ability to control the very lives of her subjects, to make them fear not just death, but the slow, agonizing suffering that came with defying her. Her reign was not one built on compassion or mercy, but on fear and terror, a fear that permeated every aspect of life in her kingdom. If you're horrified by the extent of her cruelty, share your thoughts in the comments below. How far can a ruler go before their actions become unforgivable? And don't forget to leave a like if this story left a lasting impact. Check if you're subscribed to continue exploring the dark history of the most ruthless rulers. Imagine being in a royal court where everyone seems to smile, nod, and go about their business as if everything is normal. But beneath the surface, the air is thick with tension. You can't trust anyone, not even the queen. For, insert queen's name, poisoning wasn't just a tool of assassination. It was a silent, hidden weapon she used to eliminate rivals, control her court, and maintain her iron grip on power. Unlike the dramatic executions we often associate with monarchs, the poisonings ordered by this queen were far more subtle, calculated, and terrifying. The queen didn't need a blade or a sword to kill her enemies. She simply needed a cup, a vial, and the patience to wait. The true horror lay in the quiet, invisible nature of the deaths she orchestrated. Those around her were never sure if they were the next target, and that uncertainty created a kingdom rife with paranoia and fear. One of the most chilling accounts comes from the court of insert queen's name, when she ordered the poisoning of a trusted advisor who had been by her side for years. This advisor, once a confidant, had begun to question the Queen's increasingly erratic decisions. His crime? Disagreeing with her in public. He didn't pose an immediate threat, but his insubordination was enough to seal his fate. Instead of a public execution, he was invited to a private dinner with the Queen. It was supposed to be a moment of reconciliation, an opportunity to mend their differences. But it was also the Queen's perfect opportunity to eliminate him without anyone knowing. She ordered a glass of wine, infused with a rare and slow-acting poison, to be served to her advisor. He drank it without suspicion, thinking it was a gesture of goodwill. As the poison took effect, the advisor began to feel the first signs of paralysis. He tried to speak, to cry out, but his throat grew tight, his vision blurred, and his limbs went numb. The Queen, seated across from him, watched as he struggled, completely aware that the man who had once been her closest ally was now fighting for his life, and losing. The slow, agonizing death that followed was so quiet, so private, that no one in the court ever suspected the Queen's involvement. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Poison was her weapon of choice, used not just for killing, but for control. Those who posed a threat to her, whether politically or personally, disappeared without a trace, their deaths often passed off as natural causes. The court lived in constant fear, unsure who would be next. Could they trust their food, their wine, their closest advisors? But the true horror came from the secrecy with which she operated. In public, insert Queen's name, was a model of diplomacy and charm. She was seen as a gracious and powerful ruler, loved by her people. But in the shadows, she was a ruthless manipulator, slowly and methodically eliminating anyone who threatened her reign. She understood the art of killing without leaving a mark, and that made her more dangerous than any open war or rebellion. The fear that permeated the court under her rule was not just of the obvious punishments, like execution, but of the quiet, creeping possibility of being poisoned. And it wasn't just her enemies who lived in fear. Even those closest to her, family, trusted allies, could never feel safe. In this world, the Queen didn't need to raise her voice to strike terror into the hearts of those around her. Her power was absolute, her methods terrifyingly effective. Behind the gilded walls of a royal palace, hidden away from the public eye, a Queen's secret chamber of horrors awaited those unfortunate enough to incur her wrath. While most rulers used armies and weapons to crush their enemies, insert Queen's name, preferred a more intimate, yet far more terrifying method. A torture chamber hidden deep within the palace, where prisoners would meet, their worst nightmares. For this Queen, torture wasn't just a form of punishment. It was a tool of psychological manipulation, a way to break her enemies and instill fear into the hearts of anyone who dared to defy her. The chamber was a symbol of her absolute control, a place where even the most hardened criminals, generals, or noblemen would find themselves begging for mercy. Yet mercy was a concept foreign to her. The chamber itself was a place of pure dread. The air was thick with the scent of death, and the stone walls were lined with the implements of torture. Chains, whips, and devices designed to stretch, twist, and break were scattered around the room. No one who entered left the same way. Some left broken physically, others left with their minds shattered, unable to recover from the horrors they had witnessed. But what made, insert Queen's name, torture chamber so terrifying wasn't just the physical pain, it was the prolonged psychological torment. She had perfected the art of making her enemies believe that their suffering had no end, that their very souls would be crushed long before their bodies gave out. One of her most infamous acts of cruelty was the fate of a young prince who had once been a potential ally. His kingdom had been a thorn in her side for years, and when he finally fell into her hands, She saw an opportunity not just to eliminate him, but to send a message to anyone else who thought they could challenge her. The prince was brought to the palace, shackled and brought to the torture chamber, where he was bound and forced to watch as his own family was systematically tortured before him. The queen didn't kill them right away. She made sure they suffered, ensuring that each scream and plea for mercy was heard by the prince. She wanted him to experience the horror of knowing that he could do nothing to save them. For days, he was kept alive, forced to watch his family's slow and agonizing torment. And when he begged for death, insert queen's name, granted it, but not before inflicting one final act of psychological cruelty. She had the prince's face burned into the walls of the chamber, so that it would haunt her enemies forever. The queen's methods weren't random. Every act of torture, every display of suffering, was meticulously planned to ensure maximum fear. Her torture chamber was not just a physical space. It was an experience, a nightmare that lived in the minds of her enemies long after they left her palace. But what truly made, insert queen's name, one of the most dangerous rulers in history wasn't her ability to make her enemies suffer. It was her ability to break them before they even stepped into her chamber. She created a climate of fear so pervasive that the very mention of her name sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. People didn't just fear her. They feared the possibility that they could be next. What's truly disturbing is that this queen didn't just torture criminals or political enemies. She used her chamber as a way to maintain control over her court as well. Even those who were closest to her, trusted advisors, family members, weren't safe from her wrath. They too could find themselves summoned to the chamber for the slightest perceived betrayal. Her reign became a time of darkness, a time when no one could trust anyone, not even their closest allies. The fear of being sent to the queen's torture chamber was constant, and it shaped the behavior of everyone around her. No one could challenge her authority, for fear of ending up in the depths of the palace, where pain and death awaited them. In the world of power and politics, few things are as valuable as family, at least when used correctly. But what happens when a queen views her daughters not as beloved children, but as mere tools to secure her position on the throne? The story of insert queen's name reveals the darkest side of maternal ambition, where love was replaced by strategy and innocence was traded for influence. From the moment her daughters were born, insert queen's name saw them not as heirs to her legacy, but as pawns in a dangerous game of power. She knew that to maintain control over her kingdom, she would need to forge alliances, and what better way to do that than through the marriage of her daughters to powerful rulers and nobles? But these marriages weren't acts of love or diplomacy. They were calculated moves designed to strengthen her reign, secure her throne, and eliminate any threats to her power. One of the most shocking acts of manipulation came when insert queen's name arranged a marriage for her eldest daughter to a foreign prince, a man known for his cruelty and ruthlessness. The queen knew the prince's reputation, and she knew that her daughter would be subjected to unimaginable hardships. Yet, she saw it as an opportunity to tie herself to a powerful ally, someone who would owe his loyalty to her through the marriage of her daughter. But this wasn't just a political alliance. The queen had a far more sinister plan in mind. She sent her daughter off to the prince's palace, knowing full well that the prince would treat her as nothing more than a trophy to be displayed and used. The queen's daughter was to be nothing more than a means to an end, a tool to further her mother's reign. The marriage was a nightmare from the start. The prince, cold and calculating, used his new wife as a pawn in his own schemes, and, insert queen's name, never once stepped in to protect her. Instead, she watched from afar, knowing that her daughter's suffering would eventually lead to the loyalty of the prince, who by the end of the marriage would be bound to her by blood, not love. But this wasn't the only time, insert queen's name, used her daughters in this way. Her younger daughter, too, was married off to a distant ruler, a man who had his own ambitions for power. The queen was determined to keep her enemies close. And what better way to do that than by binding them to her family through marriage? But again, this wasn't a union of love. It was a calculated move, one designed to further her power and control, regardless of the personal cost to her daughters. The true horror of insert queen's name's actions wasn't just the marriages themselves. It was the way she sacrificed her own daughters for the sake of her throne. She saw them not as individuals with their own lives, their own dreams, but as pieces to be moved around on the board of political power. And this callousness didn't go unnoticed. Those who were close to her, those who watched the queen use her daughters in this way, began to see her for what she truly was. A ruler whose ambition knew no bounds, whose love for her family was replaced by a ruthless desire for control. In the heat of battle, when blood stains the soil and the clash of swords fills the air, one would expect a queen to focus on leading her soldiers with courage, protecting her people, and securing victory. But for insert queen's name, war was not just about conquest. It was about total domination, and she wielded cruelty as a weapon as sharp as any sword in her army. Unlike other rulers who focused on the strategies of war, insert queen's name, understood something far more terrifying. The battlefield was a stage for psychological warfare, and fear was the most powerful weapon she had. She didn't just aim to defeat her enemies. She aimed to destroy them mentally and emotionally, leaving them broken and demoralized long before the first sword was drawn. One of the most horrifying examples of her cruelty on the battlefield came during a battle with a rival kingdom. The rival leader, a powerful king, had been a thorn in her side for years, and this time she vowed to make him pay. As the two armies faced off, insert queen's name, employed a tactic so brutal it sent a wave of terror through the ranks of her enemy's soldiers. Before the battle began, she had her soldiers capture a group of the enemy's most skilled warriors. These men, known for their valor and strength, were dragged in front of their comrades, bound and helpless. The queen then ordered them executed, publicly, in front of their own army. But this wasn't just about killing them. Insert queen's name took great care in the manner of their deaths. She made sure that their deaths were prolonged, their screams echoing through the ranks of their own soldiers. As the execution unfolded, insert queen's name, stood on a nearby hill, watching with cold, calculating eyes. She knew that every scream, every tortured breath, would plant a seed of fear in the hearts of her enemy's soldiers. And she was right. The sight of their warriors dying in such agony shattered their morale. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to survive. But her cruelty didn't end there. As the battle began, insert queen's name took to the front lines herself, leading her troops with a ferocity that matched the bloodlust in her eyes. She didn't just command from the back. She fought alongside her soldiers, wielding a sword that seemed to carve through her enemies with precision and brutality. No one was safe from her wrath. She had a particular penchant for targeting enemy leaders, cutting them down in full view of their own soldiers to further break their spirit. It wasn't enough for insert queen's name to win the battle. She wanted her enemies to feel utterly defeated. After the victory, she made sure the spoils of war reflected her power. She ordered the captives to be paraded through the streets, publicly humiliated before being sent to her dungeons, where they would languish in darkness, left to wither and die. Her use of cruelty wasn't just a tactic. It was a way of life, a philosophy that ran deep through her military strategies. She understood that true victory wasn't just about defeating your enemies on the battlefield. It was about breaking them before they even picked up a sword. And in this, insert queen's name, was a master. Her reputation for cruelty spread far and wide, and it wasn't just her enemies who feared her. Even her own soldiers learned to respect her ruthlessness. Disobedience was met with swift, merciless punishment. Betrayal, even the smallest hint of rebellion, would result in death. And as her reign continued, her enemies came to know that fighting against her was not just a battle for their kingdoms. It was a fight for their very lives. Imagine living in a kingdom where the mere hint of disobedience, even a whisper of defiance, could lead to unimaginable suffering. For, insert queen's name, this was not just a method of rule, it was the foundation of her entire reign. She ruled with an iron fist, but it wasn't the sword that kept her enemies in line. It was pain. Unlike many of her contemporaries who fought wars or waged political battles, insert queen's name, preferred a more direct approach to maintaining her control. Torture was her weapon of choice, and she wielded it with chilling precision. It wasn't just about punishing those who opposed her. It was about using their suffering to send a clear message to anyone who dared think they could rise against her. She wanted every subject, every enemy, to understand that resistance was futile. The price of defying her would be more than just death. It would be a slow, agonizing torment that would strip away all hope and, dignity. At the heart of her cruel reign was her personal torture chamber, a place where pain and suffering were methodically administered as part of a strategy to maintain order. The queen didn't just tolerate violence in her kingdom, she orchestrated it. She believed that by breaking her enemies down physically and emotionally, she could ensure that no one would ever rise up against her. One of her most notorious acts of cruelty involved a group of political dissidents who had been caught attempting to conspire against her. Rather than execute them immediately, she chose to make an example of them in the most horrific way possible. These men were brought to her palace, where they were subjected to days of brutal, relentless torture. The queen didn't just want them to die, she wanted them to beg for death. Each of them was subjected to different forms of pain. Some were whipped, others burned, and some had their bodies slowly mutilated in ways too grotesque to describe. But it wasn't just the physical torment that made her reign so terrifying. It was the psychological aspect of it. Those who were tortured under her command weren't just punished. They were humiliated, broken down, and reduced to nothing more than shadows of who they once were. The queen understood that the human spirit could withstand physical pain for a time, but it was the breaking of the mind, the crushing of hope, that would leave an enemy truly defeated. She didn't just use torture to eliminate threats. It became her method of control over her entire court. Every noble, every advisor, every soldier who served under her knew that any disloyalty, no matter how small, would result in unimaginable pain. This constant fear of retribution kept everyone in line. No one dared defy her because they knew that the consequences would be far worse than anything they could imagine. The queen had cultivated a culture of fear, where her enemies not only feared death, but feared the slow, torturous path that might precede it. But the most chilling part of her reign wasn't just the torture itself. It was the cold, calculating way in which she used it. She didn't act out of rage or personal vendetta. She saw torture as a means to an end. She was a ruler who believed that only through the complete and utter submission of her subjects could she secure her power. She was willing to sacrifice anything, even her humanity, to maintain that control. Her reign was one marked by silence. The silence of those who feared to speak, the silence of those who had been broken by pain. Even her enemies who were lucky enough to escape with their lives spoke of the horror they witnessed in her torture chambers, and many would never fully recover from the trauma. Some queens are remembered for their power, their achievements, or their diplomatic prowess. But there are others, like insert queen's name, whose legacy is not defined by the kingdoms they ruled or the titles they held, but by the deep, suffocating fear they instilled in those around them. Their reigns were not built on respect or admiration, but on terror, a terror so intense that it haunted every corner of their realm, long after they were gone. Insert queen's name. Ruled with an iron fist, her methods cruel and her resolve unyielding. She was a queen who sought not just to control, but to break the spirits of those who dared challenge her. Her punishments were swift, brutal, and often publicly humiliating. But the most terrifying part of her rule was the silence that followed. Those who were lucky enough to survive her punishments, or those who dared to speak out, were not given freedom. They were given something far worse: a life in the shadow of fear. For, insert queen's name, fear was the ultimate tool of control. It wasn't enough to eliminate her enemies. She needed them to live in constant dread of what would happen next. She understood that once fear was sown into the hearts of her people, they would be her subjects forever. They would never question her power, never defy her, because they knew that the price of disobedience was something more horrifying than death. It was the possibility of an endless cycle of suffering. But, insert queen's name, didn't just create fear through violence. She used silence as a weapon, too. She made sure that the stories of those who disappeared under her rule, those who were imprisoned, tortured, or executed, were erased from history. Their names, their fates, buried beneath the sands of time. In her world, if you fell out of favor, you were not only punished, but erased. The fear of being forgotten, of being cast into obscurity, became one of the most terrifying aspects of her reign. What makes, insert queen's name, truly haunting is that, even after her death, her legacy of fear continued. The stories of her cruelty were passed down through generations, whispered in dark corners, with children warned to behave or face the fate of those who had once crossed her. Her name may have been erased from official records, but her reputation lingered, a shadow that stretched long after her time on the throne. Her reign may have ended, but the trauma she inflicted on her kingdom didn't disappear with her death. The people who lived through it, those who survived the terror, carried those scars with them for the rest of their lives. And the silence she left behind, the complete erasure of any trace of those who fell victim to her cruelty, haunted the generations that followed. Leave a comment below. How do you think history shapes the legacies of those who rule with fear? What kind of impact do you think such a reign would have on the people who lived under it? And don't forget to like the video if this story left you with a chilling sense of history's forgotten queens. Make sure you're subscribed to continue exploring the darkest corners of history and uncover more hidden truths from the past.